Mr. Gibson, it is definitely a pleasure meeting you, doing this interview. It really is an honor. You're someone I've looked up to for many years, so I really, really enjoy this opportunity.
Well, you were short then, so
Yeah.
you had to look up, but as you've grown, it gets less and less.
So you were a journalist for many years, at least 30 years at ABC News. You could tell that news was your passion. It's what you love to do. Now that you are retired, what are you up to now? I'm curious.
It's a business, I think, where it's binary. You either do it or you don't. It's awfully difficult to sort of keep your hand in, particularly at the level that I was at, which fortunately was pretty high. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to keep your hand in if you're not doing it full time. So when it came time that I thought it would be good to retire, I thought, do you try to do a few things? People said, don't you want to do an hour on this? No. So it really was retire. And so I do a little speech making, which I do basically to get down on paper what I'm thinking about. But for the most part, I am retired. I am slothful. I am indolent. Your golf game does not improve when you retire. It perhaps gets worse, but you try. My wife and I are doing a lot of traveling. And retirement, I'm here to tell you, although it's many, 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 many years away for you, it can be very satisfying, very fulfilling.
Do you miss it?
No. There are some things that I miss. Any news organization is collaborative. And if I could have done anything in my life, I would have played professional baseball. But then they started to curve the ball and I couldn't hit it. But that sense of teamwork, of dependency on other people, mm-hmm. I often went down to the control room where they were putting the tape pieces together shortly before a program. And we would have 5, 6, 7 pieces in the evening newscast from reporters all around the world. And at 10 minutes before showtime, probably 5 of those pieces weren't into New York yet. They weren't done. And you realize that there's some tape editor in Frankfurt, Germany, or somebody out in Los Angeles or whatever, in whose hands your show exists. Yeah. That's a wonderful kind of teamwork. And so I miss that. I miss the rush of that. I miss the people that I worked with. But do I miss the news? No. The business was going in directions that A, I didn't particularly like, mm-hmm. and B, I didn't understand. You understand the social media better than I do. And so much of what's being done now is involved with social media that I don't understand. And so I thought it's time to get out, and I think it was indeed the right time.
What is it that you didn't like about the direction that journalism is going?
It is so much more, the commercial imperatives are so much more important. And I don't mean commercials in terms of 30 seconds for Buick or whatever. I mean in terms of the business pressures. We're getting now more and more news sources, quote unquote. And maintaining an audience becomes harder and harder. And the lines between what is truly news and what is just stuff that people are curious about mm-hmm. Is getting greater and greater. Not to pick out any one particular story, but is the story of Kate Middleton's, the Duchess of, what is she, the Duchess of something or other? Cornwall, I think. Are the fact that somebody took pictures from her from half a mile away with no top on, is that a story? Okay, for 30 seconds one night, but night after night after night, mm-hmm. which is what's going on? No, it's not a story. But it is of interest to people. Does it matter in the long run? No. Is it unfortunate? Sure. Does it say something about modern society? Yes. But it's not a story. And yet, the evening newscasts are doing it night after night after night. So as I say, the lines between what people need to know and what they want to know are getting blurry. And in order to maintain audience, you have to give people what they want to know, and not so much what you think they need to know. Mm-hmm. The fuzzing of those lines is what I'm talking about.
During your last newscast at ABC World News, the farewell video that they put together, it started off with 4 presidents congratulating you and wishing you well on your retirement. I'm very interested to know, how was it developing that rapport with high government officials, with celebrities, to have so many people that think of you so highly.
You're right, it began with a bunch of presidents, but what I liked best about that goodbye tape was President Obama came last, and right before him was Kermit the Frog. And I thought that juxtaposition was very nice. People say, you know, what do you do to prepare for an interview? When you interview the President of the United States, it's just different. Whether or not that president is controversial, whether or not that president has done some really stupid things in the last month or whatever, the President of the United States is due a respect that really needs to be afforded in a way that I don't think you need to afford to anybody else. So it's just different. But they know, they're sort of intrigued by the news business. They play it more and more. And they know what you're about, and you can, they love to talk about what's going on, and they love to talk about stuff that's going on with other, I remember we got an interview with President Bush, the second, with 43, George W. Bush, and they let us on Air Force One, and we did the interview on Air Force One as we flew down to Georgia, and they said, well, you'll have 20 minutes with the president, and you're to set up in this, what they call the Oval Office on Air Force One, although it's just a little cubbyhole. And that's it. You'll have to come in, do the interview, get out, 20 minutes.
Okay.
We got on the plane, and one of his assistants came up and said, come on up front, the president wants to just talk. And he, you know, I mean, presidents are just people, and he wanted to put his feet up, and he wanted to talk sports, and he wanted to talk about what's going on, and he wanted to talk about the networks and how the network news business was going, and what I thought the future of it. It was just, they like to, you know, they like to be able to put their feet up and talk, and when you get a chance to do that, we did a show with in the East Room of the White House on healthcare at the beginning of the healthcare debate, and we did it from 10 to 11 o'clock at night on primetime on ABC. But they let us do the news in the Blue Room that night. So at 6:30 we had a half an hour to do the news in the Blue Room. And the president came down, President Obama came down, and he just wanted to, you know, schmooze. Wow. They like that kind of contact. And so if they trust you, and you hope they do, it's not hard to develop a relationship if you have the time, and if they'll give you the time. And they're, in most cases, perfectly willing to do that.
One of the big stories that you were able to cover while at ABC News, you were working on the day of the coverage of 9/11. And I think that seems like it would be a very big responsibility to be in New York, where some of the attacks happened, reporting the news to a whole nation that is getting scared. You have to remain calm. How was that for you to have that type of responsibility?
You're talking about on 9/11 itself,
yeah.
and afterwards. Well, we were on the air when the first plane hit, and I will never forget. Diane and I were sitting in the studio, Good Morning America, and we were about 15 minutes from the end of the broadcast, and we had run over. We were in a commercial. We weren't going to be able to do the next segment that we had planned because there wasn't time for it. And so we're just sitting discussing what to do. We have the stage manager has just said 1 minute, and they were going to come back. And a guy named Stu Schwartz, who was a producer in the control room for us, said, something has just happened at the World Trade Center. There are flames coming out of the side of the building. A plane may have hit the building. We have a traffic camera poised, pointing at the building. You're on the air, go. And you have to, at that point, essentially say, we don't know any more than you do. You know, this is what we're seeing. We don't know what it is. We don't know whatever. Needless to say, you go to the pictures rather quickly, and we also very quickly went to a special report, which means that we were on in the whole country, not just in a couple of time zones. And you're focused on the pictures, and so we're writing notes madly about, you know, when did the blind sheikh organize the attack on the, when did a plane hit the Empire State Building? How many people work in the World Trade Centers? Is that both of the centers or just one of the towers? Do we know this was the South Tower that was hit first? No, I'm sorry, it was the North Tower that was hit first. Do we know what companies are in there, et cetera, et cetera? We're just grasping for information. And then the second plane hit. And it's amazing how fast your mind works. and something came into the side of the frame, and my first thought was, because it was forest fire season in California, that maybe it was one of those planes with a fire retardant thing, you know, hanging from its belly. But then you thought, where would you get that in New York? And then my second thought was, it's a traffic copter. No, it's too big for that. And then it hit. And I will forever think back about what we said at the time. Diane, in the very human reaction, said, "Oh my God." And I wish I'd done the same, but I said, now we know what's going on. We're under attack. And I went for the, you know, the sort of who, what, why, where, when reporter's reaction. She went for the human reaction, and I admire her for that. I admire her for a lot of things, but I admire her particularly for that. She was just thinking of all the people and all of the lives that would be lost. And mine was, how are we going to cover this, and how big is the story, and whatever. And of course, we were on the air for days and days and days after that. The interesting part was the next day. As I walked into the studio, you know, we'd been working for 24 hours about getting guests and making sure we had the mayor, and, you know, everybody had great stories. But the next day I remember thinking to myself, you know, the specifics of the stories that we're going to have on the air is not as important as the tone that Diane and I adopt. And I'd never thought about that in terms of going on the air. What tone are we going to try to set? I do remember thinking to myself, this is the most important story you'll ever report. And also thinking, everything that you've done in 30-some years in this business is predicate to this point, to this moment in your life. And I thought the tone that we had to adopt had to be reassuring. There were 4,000 planes in the air that morning, and they got 4. Okay, we're too strong as a nation to let this break us. This is going to be catastrophic in terms of the nation's psyche, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be self-defeating. It doesn't have to tear us down. We are too strong as a country, and so you try to be reassuring, and you just say, we're going to hear this stuff, learn this stuff along with you, and you want to be sympathetic, you want to be empathetic, but you want to be reassuring, and I think that was the right tone to adopt.
How about the response to the coverage? I know afterwards there was, media is always criticized, but this is such a big event that they're writing in history books. What do you think about any response that you heard to ABC's 9/11 coverage?
Well, you know, people come up and say, you were my company every morning for weeks after that, or whatever, and that's flattering in a way. But people will say, you got us through that, or you got me through that. There were other shows on the air, and some people watch them unwisely, but anyway. But people do say that, you got me through that, and that's the nicest thing that they can say, that they tuned in every morning, and that we were at their breakfast table, and they were at ours, because we would basically put a table in the middle of the studio, and we sat there for 6 hours every morning broadcasting, and basically just saying, here's what we know today, and or here's what we're going to try to learn today. The country was united in a way that was amazing at that time. The flags that you saw in cars hanging from barns everywhere. The United States Congress that can't agree on what day it is. We're out on the steps of the Capitol, Democrats and Republicans alike, singing America the Beautiful. That was an amazing moment. Unfortunately, things have happened since that I think have divided the country in ways that are unfortunate, because we were so united then. But it is exemplary of the fact that in times of adversity, when we feel threatened as a people, as a country, we pull together. And that to me was inspiring. I thought the country's reaction was inspiring, and I suspect, God help us, if something like that happened again, we would pull together in the same way. You mentioned Diane a little while ago. I'm curious, what do you think of the... Diane who? Diane Sawyer. Oh, yes, right, I forgot. I'm curious, what do you think of the program now? Well, Diane is a consummate news person, and she has great empathy for stories that are show people in trouble, and I think what they're doing in terms of Made in America is very. It's just I love those reporters. They all work for me. I work with them. It is a terrific reportorial corps, and I still get the rundown every night of the program. It's
really?
Emailed to me, and when I see a reporter that I particularly like, and when they're doing something that really interests me, I make sure I'm watching. And I sometimes you know too much. I mean, I know how much effort went into that piece, or I know that had to have been edited late, or that, I know by the correspondent who did it that it must have been this and that and the other thing, and why didn't such and such a correspondent do it? And it's almost too much inside knowledge, and so I watch both to find out what's going on, and then also to see just how the news division that I love is still operating.
I had the chance to ask this next question to Brian Williams, and I'd also like to ask you, a lot of people who are interested in media, we could just imagine what competition is like for you guys, for you as the anchors of the three main newscasts. But as a person who's actually in there, the one whose name is actually on the newscast, what do you think of competition and the competition between the three?
Well, while I was there, we were second and we were first, and being first was better. You want to be first, and you are keenly aware of that competition, and you want to know what did the other guys have, and did they have a story we didn't have, or whatever. But in terms of ratings, no, you can't worry about that, and I'll tell you why. We now have minute-by-minute ratings, so that you can look at the show and you can see, the audience went up incrementally while you're doing a story on Mitt Romney's tape that got released. And then it went up a little higher when Obama commented on such and such and such and such. And then we did a story on this and it went down. And then we did a story on new health cure for something or other, and it went up again. If you begin to look at those things, you then begin to think, well, let's program more stories of the kind that have the audience go up. Even in a minute and a half, you can see, a 2-minute piece, you can see the audience move one way or the other. So minute by minutes, while they're like crack to producers, I think are basically not good. Ratings as a whole are not good. Because if you win a night, you think, what did we do that night that got people? And if you lose the next night, what did we do that night that lost people? You can't program that way. You have to think, what's the most important news? What do people need to know? And that's what goes into broadcast. And if they watch, great. And if the other guy wins that night, well, we'll try to get him tomorrow. So you're conscious of it. You'd like to be, as I say, it's better to be number one. But you cannot program an evening newscast. You can't assemble a newspaper solely thinking about what's going to get ratings or what's going to get the most readership. You have to think about what do people need to know. And so the competition is important, but it can't be the most important thing you do.
Now
what did Brian say?
He seemed a lot more competitive. Whether or not he was speaking more directly from himself rather than on behalf of the news organization, although you are retired, it sounds like you're trying to speak a little bit for ABC.
Not really, although that's an interesting observation. Not really. Brian's a very competitive guy, and he's doing very well. But I really do think that that's what you have to keep in mind. And maybe that's why when I left we were number 2. I don't know. We started out as number 1 and we finished at number 2. And I'd rather have finished at number 1, but it really was what I kept in mind all the time as we programmed the show.
A presidential election year is a very big year for news networks, the conventions, the primaries, the election. It also gets a lot of ratings, and you went through many elections that you were covering. Now that you are not in the game and you are watching the other networks, I want to know what...
I had been to the last 40 conventions. And actually that goes back 20 elections. No, is that right? 20? No, it's not right. The last 20. I had been to the last 20. and these were the first two I hadn't been to. And I didn't miss it. I had the opportunity to do that. I had the election of a lifetime in 2008. I hold no water for John McCain or for Barack Obama. John McCain might have made a great president. He's a good man. But I never thought in my lifetime that I would see the election of an African American. And I always thought in that primary cycle, this is, you know, the country was I think, going to vote for the Democrat no matter who it had been that year because there was such a strong reaction against George Bush. So I thought John McCain was always running for second place. But I always knew in that primary, we're either going to elect a black man or we're going to elect a woman. And what does that say about this country? I mean, it is a, you know, the women didn't have the vote 100 years ago. And I think it speaks a lot in what this country's about. And so that was the election of a lifetime for me. And we had some amazing stories. In 2000, we had 9/11, we had whatever. And I thought this was as good as it can get. You can never predict what the news is going to be, but I had a series of amazing experiences. And so I don't miss it because I had a chance to do it all. And I'm very grateful for that.
What do you think of the current status of journalism? The cable channels,
Well, I always thought that we were very fortunate that we had a half an hour to sum things up and we didn't have to fill 24 hours. Because you see that so much of what the cable channels do is filler, and it's a bunch of people screaming at each other, and I don't find it very educational. So I was always very pleased, and I believe in the evening newscast as a sort of art form, because you try to get as much news as you can into a half hour and make it a good program at the same time that people will want to watch. So I'm not crazy about the directions the news business is going in for the reasons I mentioned earlier, that it's getting to be so much of an emphasis on rating and on the business side, and newspapers are starved for money. You can see newspapers getting a smaller and smaller news hole all the time. You can see television operations trying to do as much as they did or more with less money, and that eats into coverage in ways that are important. It's tough for journalism students, year one. It's tough for journalism students because it's a great business. It is a great thing to do, and it's different every day, and it provides a national service, and we need good journalism more than ever. We need it. But for people like you who are young, figuring, how am I going to make a living at this? The sand is shifting underneath your feet. We don't know. One of the friends of mine who's a media futurist who works at New York University equates it, this is a very imperfect equation, but he equates it to the time Gutenberg invented the printing press. We knew that was going to change, the world knew it was going to change everything in terms of the way information was dispensed. They just didn't know how it was going to evolve. We're in that time now. We're in a time where we know the dissemination of information is going to come in different ways than somebody like I grew up with. But we don't know what it's going to be. So how do you monetize this business that you want to be in? How do you make a living at it? Do you work for a website that has, a very small audience? Can you make money at that? Will you be able to make money if you work for a network and be able to support, a wife and 2 children who throw up on the living room rug and a barbecue pit in the back? You want to be able to have a profession that fascinates you and at the same time allows you to support a family. But we don't know what that's going to be. It's going to work out. And I believe you'll be okay in time because it will evolve. Maybe not in your generation, but it's going to evolve. And because the need for journalism, it will always be there. And I think right now in this country it's greater than ever.
Mr. Camlett, the Dean of School Communications here, has talked highly of you many times. I know he worked pretty closely with you. I would like you just to talk a little bit about your relationship with him and when you met him and what it was like.
We don't talk to each other. We have no truck for each other. He knows too much about me that I'm afraid he'll tell, and I know too much about no. I worked with Lee early on in his career. I first knew him when he was a junior reporter on Capitol Hill, and I was a reporter there as well. And then when he worked for ABC for a long time, and then this other network, the National Biscuit Company, I think it's called, went and hired him for a while, but we were able to get him back to ABC. And he was a terrific producer, a terrific writer. He's a great human being, with a wonderful family and a wife about whom I'm very fond. And he called me one day and he said, there's this job open at Quinnipiac College, and I would love to have it. And I thought, well, he's not an academic. He's somebody who has done everything in the network business, but he's not an academic. And I don't know what universities like Quinnipiac hire in terms of deans of communication. But I had just a couple of years prior to that gotten the Fred Friendly Award from Quinnipiac. Right. And so I had the audacity to pick up the phone and call President Leahy and said, you should hire this guy. That's not what got him hired, I can guarantee you that, but because he went through a pretty rigorous interviewing program. But he knows the business backwards and forwards. He knows all the aspects of the business. And I think, therefore, a college has to take a chance on somebody like that, hiring them as a dean, because he hasn't done this before. But I think it's working out pretty well, and I'm very happy for him. And more than that, I'm happy for Quinnipiac, because he is so enthusiastic about what he's doing. And he's so enthusiastic about people like you, and all of the people who work here who he thinks are just great kids. You have to have that if you want to be in teaching. You have to just love kids, and he does. And that makes for a pretty successful dean, I think.
And last question, for aspiring journalists like me, there are many of them here at this school. Do you have any advice that you haven't talked about already?
Not really. It's, you have to find your own way. There's an awful lot of kids who come to get entry-level jobs at the network, and they get a lot of coffee, and they work the heck out of the Xerox machine and all that. And I think that's valuable because you become known to the people you're working with. But I always tell people, if you want to be a reporter and you want to be on the air, go to a small station. You won't make any money there, but you'll find out if you're good. And nobody will really be honest with you about whether you're good. You really have to trust your own internal compass. And mine was in Lynchburg, Virginia, where I earned the princely sum of $6,500 a year. Now that was a long time ago. I'm sure they're paying $6,800 now. But it was a place to learn and to make mistakes, and I made them all. But you need to get those mistakes sort of out of your system as much as you can. You'll still make mistakes all the time. The fallibility of a reporter is great, but you learn the basics of a story, how to tell a story, who you trust as a source and who you don't. All those things are important, and I think you work better in small stations and work your way up. And if you find out, hey, I'm not terribly good at this, either I'm not very good on the air, or I don't really edit very well in pieces, or I'm not the kind of reporter I think I ought to be, then you can go on to something else, because it is a skill that is highly transferable to other professions, I think. But I think it's one where you have to go and find out for yourself, can I do this? So rather than run the Xerox machine, I think it's better to, as I say, if you can, to go to a small station and just do it. And figure out for yourself, am I good at this or not?
Well, Mr. Gibson, thank you very much.
Nice to meet you.
I really
Good luck to you.